Good morning, everybody. I was just trying to regroup and decide where we were left off. I was momentarily distracted. I think we have finished with ORS cross with this group, right? So, welcome back, and we'll continue with cross for this panel.
Mr. Chairman,
All right. Yes, sir. Mr. Welby.
My recollection was that you had gotten to Commissioner's question when we closed on Friday.
No, we had not, because Commissioner Elam was worried that we were going to that I was going to excuse him before he got a chance to ask him questions, but he had no confidence. But we still have we had finished ORS, so I think that's why you were thinking that. All right, Mr. Elliott.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Kind of worries me when you've had a whole weekend of rest, Mr. Elliott, and you're kind of fresh on. Just wanted to throw that out first thing.
Well, I had plenty to keep me busy this weekend, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rooks.
Yes, sir.
You're the rates man for the company, correct?
Correct.
And you've been involved in designing rates for many, many years, as long as I can remember, but I might say 15 years, but you may not be that old. How long has it been?
Certainly since 1996. So.
Yeah, you're longer than I thought. And as I understand it, in your effort to design rates, you collect input from various divisions or sections of the company, correct?
I do.
You would get information, I think, from probably Ms. Griffin's office, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you might get information from Mr. Richards, perhaps?
Other folks on the team would, yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, and basically you gather all the information and you gather the inputs, cost of service, and that sort of thing, and you design the rates. Do I understand that correctly?
That's correct. When it comes to a revenue requirements basis, then it comes to my team to design the rates.
Very fine, thank you. Now, as I understand it from your testimony, in designing these rates, you have included some benefits from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Am I correct?
Correct.
And if I understand your testimony correctly, the NND tax rider is currently calculated to produce an initial 1.9% bill reduction. Do you recall testifying to that?
Yes.
And further, I think you testified that the customer benefit plan will also include a tax rider to pass along to customers non-NND related effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe you testified that the tax rider is calculated to produce a 2.7% bill reduction. Am I correct?
Yes.
And if we look, you filed tariffs, I think, with your testimony, and I think you've corrected those tariffs since, correct?
Correct.
And I want to show you, just for a couple of examples, let me show you the proposed rate 8 tariff document that you filed, and I believe I have the corrected one. All right, so get rid of my clip. I have highlighted rate 8 in the upper left-hand corner, have I not?
Yeah, it appears so.
And this is residential service, as I understand it, correct?
Correct.
And if we move down into the body of the tariff, we see, I hope I haven't, we see that the NND tax rider reads as follows. The above charges will be reduced by 1.93% to reflect the NND tax rider as approved by the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. Have I read that correctly?
You have.
And if we look below that, immediately below that, it says tax rider. The above charges will be reduced by 2.79% to reflect the tax rider as approved by the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. Do you see that? Have I read that correctly?
Yes.
And it's a little hard for me to read, so don't trust me. And I'm not going to go through all this, but I will, just for general principle's sake, put up the rate 23 tariff, which is the Industrial Power Service tariff. Do you see that?
I do.
And if I just scroll down here, as it were, to the NND tax rider and the tax rider, the NND tax rider reads as in the previous tariff, the above charges will be reduced by 1.93% to reflect the NND tax rider as approved by the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. Have I read that correctly?
You have.
And then the tax rider, the above charges will be reduced by 2.79% to reflect the tax rider as approved by the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. Have I read that correctly?
Yes.
And again, as I understand it, and without boring everybody in the room, I think those same provisions are in your probably small general and medium general tariff documents, aren't they?
Yes, that's correct.
And so small general would be Mr. Knapp's membership, and I think the medium would probably be the Walmart type customers. Would that be correct?
Generally so, yes.
So you've got it applicable to all the ratepayers, correct?
Correct.
Now, I think that you would agree that when you combine those, the resulting reduction is it 4.72%?
That sounds about right.
All right. Now, I would like to show you Hearing Exhibit 52, if I may, and I'm going to trouble Ms. Wheat. This is Hearing Exhibit 52, and I'm not interested in the first page of that two-page exhibit. I'm interested in the second page. Would you please turn to the second page of that exhibit?
Okay.
And that second page document I don't know about anybody else, but I think I can make all that out. I think, does the document on the Elmo accurately represent the document in front of you that's in evidence as Hearing Exhibit 52?
It appears so, yeah.
All right, good. Now, this document was introduced into evidence to demonstrate the impacts of the various plans by various factors in controversy here. Would that be sort of a fair general statement?
Yeah, that's fair.
All right. And so it's the NND portion of typical residential electric bill summary by plan. Now, first I think I'd like to understand there's a dark bar up there at the top, and it reads, estimated NND portion of typical residential bill, parentheses, excluding transmission, close parentheses. Do you see that?
I do.
All right, and so for the purposes of this bill, I think you need to help me understand what the transmission NND costs are, and as I understand the company's position, and you would understand this because you are the rates analyst. The company takes the position that certain transmission facilities, I think Mr. Richards testified to this on Friday, are complete or about to be complete and are therefore used and useful or about to be used and useful. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Now, these transmission upgrades were constructed under the authority of the company's base load review orders. You understand that to be correct, don't you?
Yes, I believe so.
All right, and of the $445 million of annual revenue raised by the revised rates, about $32 million of that revenue is attributable to the transmission costs. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so as you account for all this, what the company proposes to do, and what your rates purport to do, is to eliminate $413 million from the revised rates revenue, but leave $32 million in revised rates going forward to pay for the financing costs of that transmission construction. Isn't that true?
Yes, return on would stay apart. My understanding is that any costs related to O&M, depreciation, property taxes, and the like would be deferred for treatment in a future rate proceeding.
Correct, but you want to keep the revised rates going as long as you can for to recover the $32 million a year, correct?
$32 million would stay in rates. Correct?
All right.
Correct.
And of course, you're here under the abandonment section of the Base Load Review Act, which, as you understand, would not support the recovery of revised rates, don't you?
Say that again?
You're seeking benefits under the abandonment provision of the BLRA. You understand that?
Yes, I do.
But yet the company is still seeking to keep revised rates treatment for the transmission costs, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So So I would ask you to think about this. If you look in the first column, we show that the typical residential customer bill is currently $147.53. Do you see that?
Yeah, that's as of May 2017. So
all right, very fine. And you see just above that gray shaded bar, it has a figure of $25.10. Do you see that?
I do.
And that $25.10 represents the NND portion of a typical residential customer electric bill, excluding transmission.
That's correct.
And just to be clear, the customer is still paying for those transmission costs in rates today, correct?
Yes.
And you're recovering $32 million of those transmission costs and rates today, correct?
On an annualized basis, yes.
And would you agree with me that actually the customers are paying not just $25.10 of NND costs, but they're actually paying $27.05 for NND costs when you include transmission? That would be approximately correct, wouldn't it?
Total, I believe, is $27.03.
$27.03? All right, good.
For a 1,000 kilowatt hour residential bill.
Well, I was within 2 cents. Thank you. So you're saying it's $27.03? $27.03. So they're actually paying another $1.92. So if we look at these columns going across, then instead of $17.97, the customers would be paying about another $1.92 on top of that, correct?
Well, those are transmission costs, not
just adding the transmission costs.
NND costs. So,
but the transmission costs.
This chart is showing amounts excluding transmission.
But if you include the transmission costs that the customers are paying under scenario 2, it would go up by that $17.97 would go up by $1.93, correct?
Yeah, if you were including transmission.
Right. Well, that's good. That's what I'm trying to do. And so I won't correct all that for the record, but but we can agree that the customers are actually paying a higher NND cost when you include transmission than what's represented by hearing exhibit number 52, correct?
They're paying amounts associated with transmission in current rates. Yes, correct.
Excellent, thank you. Now, let's continue to look at this exhibit because it has a whole lot in it. Now, when we look at the first column to the left, the May 2017 typical bill, that's $147.53, correct?
Right.
Now, when you look at the next four columns, the SCE&G base plan, SCE&G no merger benefits plan, joint applicants customer benefits plan, and joint applicants alternative plan, each one of those plans has a footnote 1. Do you see that?
I do.
And when you go down to footnote 1, you read that the rates that are cited there are inclusive of estimated tax reform impacts and relative to the May 2017 bill. Do you see that?
I do.
And so as I read that footnote, if we look at the SC&G base plan, for instance, which according to this exhibit produces a monthly bill for the typical residential customer of $140.40, that actually includes the impacts of the tax cut, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so if we think about the impacts of the tax cut, if we go back to your calculation of 4.72%, if you apply the tax cut of that amount to the typical customer bill of $147.53, you actually reduce that typical bill by $6.96, would you not?
Well, I believe you said 472. That was under the customer benefits plan. Under the base plan, I believe that percentage is 4.83%, I believe.
So it's higher.
Yeah.
But if we use, since I didn't calculate that, but if we just assume a 4.72 rate cut under the to the customers as of today, that bill would go down to $140.57, correct?
I'm not sure of your math there, but I do know that the only difference between the 147.53 and the 140.40 is the impact of the tax rider associated with the base plan, because there was no impact or no change to the rates that were in effect there, other than that tax rider.
Well, we're going to the same place, but my point is that the parties are asking the Commission to reduce SC&G's rates by the impact of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, are they not?
Yes.
And I thought I understood Mr. Addison when he testified to tell this Commission that the company was purposeful in its intent to reduce its customers' rates according to the impact of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Did you understand him to testify to that?
That sounds fair.
All right. So if we assume that the Commission did nothing else in this proceeding but to reduce the typical residential customer's rate of $147.53 by the impact of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, it would reduce that customer's rate to approximately $140.57 a month, correct?
$140.40.
All right, so I'll take your number. So if we were going to compare the typical customer's rate today, or as of May 17, and the SC&G base plan, we would actually demonstrate that the typical customer today, if the Commission gave them the tax cut benefits, would be $140.40. Correct?
I don't know that I'd agree with that, because these different plans have different amounts that are being written off, and they have different amortization periods for the rates. So I don't know that it's an apples-to-apples comparison if we want to try to do that math across every column there. I don't think you can do that.
Well, but you're comfortable with my number of $140.40 to the typical customer, residential customer bill, as I put it on this slide, aren't you?
Yeah, if we're just looking strictly at the current rates and the impact of the tax reform, that's approximately correct.
All right, so So the base plan really doesn't give the customers any more than they would get if the Commission simply reduced rates by the amount of the tax cut, correct?
Generally speaking, yes.
All right. And so if we look at the SCE&G no merger benefits plan, we see that rate would be $136.07, correct?
Right.
But that rate includes this 4.72% rate reduction to give the customers the benefit of the Tax Cut Act, correct?
Correct.
All right. And so that really is $4 a month less than what the customer would get if the Commission did no more than give the residential customers the benefit of the Tax Cut Act, correct?
Correct. Again, you have different amortization periods associated with those plans. I believe the base plan goes over a longer period there, and the no merger benefits plan is over a 20-year period for recovery of those costs in the plan.
Thank you. And then if we look at the joint applicants alternative.
I correct that. The no merger benefits plan is actually 3%. I'm thinking of the customer benefits plan. That's one column over to the right. That would be a 20-year amortization.
All right, sir. And so according to your Exhibit 52, if we look at the joint application alternative plan, the monthly rate would be $126.96, and that includes a 4.72% benefit from the Tax Cut Act, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I object. This is an exhibit that Mr. Rooks did not prepare. This was presented by Dominion, and Dominion witnesses capable of testifying as to this exhibit were here last week. We haven't raised this objection before because I understood that we were going at a somewhat superficial level. But if we're now being asked to interpret this particular exhibit and the calculations made in the exhibit, Mr. Rooks is not the right witness to do that.
Okay, we're going to overrule. He's the rates guy, so he can answer it if he can.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, so again, I think my question was, under the joint applicants alternative plan, the monthly bill of $126.96 includes a 4.72 benefit afforded the ratepayer by the Job Cuts Act, correct?
It does include amounts associated with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I'm not sure of the exact amount. So I don't know, again, I don't know if the plans are equivalent on a percentage basis, but it does include the impacts on an annualized basis of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Great, thank you. Now, I note from the Exhibit 52 that the H4375 rate is not impacted by any the effects of the Jobs Cut Act, correct?
It's not.
All right, and so if we wanted to compare apples to apples using Hearing Exhibit 52, in looking at H4375, if we wanted to compare it to the SCE&G rates on Exhibit 52, we would need to reduce that 125.34 rate by 4.72% to get to the to get to what the rate would be if the Commission awarded the company the rates in H4375, but reduced all customers' rates by the 4.72% that you're proposing in this docket, correct?
Not necessarily, because that H4375 plan does not include any amortization. And so if we were to take just an example, the ORS amount proposed at March 2015 would allow for about $2.8 billion of abandoned costs. And so there's, I did some rough calculations before coming up here, and that's about $138 million $138 million annually in amortization costs. I would note that these other plans account for a return of and return on capital. So there's an amortization component in the rest of these plans. That's not necessarily in that plan. And also, if you look at the tax reform impacts of the three plans filed in the petition, they range from anywhere from $100 to $120 million. So I would note that amortization just by itself on an annualized basis would outstrip any benefits of tax reform there. So while it doesn't, you're correct, it doesn't include tax reform, I would note that it doesn't include any return of capital as well.
Thank you. And if the Commission were to impose a rate that would result in a $125.34 monthly bill on your customers and were to reduce it further by the impact of the Jobs Cut, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the actual resulting rate, monthly rate to the customer would be $118.38, wouldn't it?
Again, we'll agree to disagree on the math there. While it does not include the benefits of tax reform in that particular column, again, it doesn't provide for a return of capital either. So I don't think that makes it an apples-to-apples comparison when we say we should just add the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act amount onto that.
All right, and then if you look at the ORS Optimal Plan, the footnote 3 says all-in impact of ORS Optimal Plan or ORS Plan relative to May 2018 bill. Do you see that footnote?
I do.
And do you agree with me that based on the footnote, the ORS Optimal Plan of $116.77 is the actual ORS recommendation to this Commission for a typical residential customer using 1,000 kilowatts of electricity a month?
Yeah,
Isn't that true?
That's their testimony.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I'd move this into the next hearing exhibit.
Mr. Chairman, I object that Mr. Rooks has made clear that the math Mr. Elliott imposed on this exhibit was wrong, and he disagreed with it. So if Mr. Elliott wants to have a witness testify as to the accuracy of the math that he incorrectly did from the microphone, perhaps that could be entered. But Mr. Rooks has clearly not authenticated or indicated as correct what Mr. Elliott has imposed on the document.
Okay, what are we entering?
This is page 2 of.
Go ahead.
Page 2 of Hearing Exhibit 52, and on this document, I've simply taken the company's exhibit, and I've marked on there $27.03 for total NND impact, which was his number, not mine. I have reduced the $147.53 to $140.40, representing just the impact of the Tax Cut Act on that typical bill, with which he did not dispute. And then while he had a number of reasons why he thought that the House Bill 4375 rate was not an apples-to-apples comparison, he did not dispute the math. And so thus, it's a very simple function of adding and subtracting, and I'm just offering it into the evidence because it would help the Commission understand a little better what the Exhibit 52 does and does not do.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, the testimony that has been taken down on the record indicates what Mr. Elliott has asked. Exhibit 52 is already in the record. The only addition he's trying to include is material that Mr. Rooks, the rates guy, disagreed with. So there's no basis to introduce this math and a not apples-to-apples comparison into the record.
Mr. Elliott, do I take it from what you just said that the only thing that you really added to this exhibit was in the first column? Do I just see the first numbers there?
The first column and the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 column. Underneath the, I took the impact of the House bill and gave the ratepayers the full benefit of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, and I put that number in the record. And I think this is a demonstrative of this, and I have not otherwise tampered with the exhibit.
Okay, and I'm unclear. What was Mr. Rook's view on that last column that you added? I can't remember what he said specifically about it.
Sure. His view is that he doesn't think that 125.34 is a apples to apples comparison, for instance, to 126.96. But what I thought I understood him to say was that we would have to agree to disagree, but that he would not question my math.
I think, if I may, Mr. Chairman, the record will reflect what Mr. Rooks said. If any of the commissioners have any questions as to why this is an inaccurate comparison, they can ask Mr. Rooks the same point. Our objection is to the introduction of this manipulated exhibit. I don't mean that in nefarious ways, but a manipulated exhibit that the only witness testifying as to this exhibit disagrees with.
Mr. Chairman, I'd recommend we let it in and just take it for what it's worth under the representations that have been made. We have a representation as to what it is and a possible disagreement by Mr. Rooks, but his testimony is in the record, so we can consider it with that in mind and take it for what it's worth. So I recommend admission as Exhibit 133.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, Commissioner Hamilton.
Mr. Chairman, I would feel that we should take this into consideration and we can decide the value of it. But at the same time, I think we could ask Mr. Rooks if he would give us a chart that, as he requested, that shows his amortization and the benefit of the full tax cut. Could we do that, Mr. Chairman?
Could the company furnish such an exhibit, late file?
Yes, we're happy to do so.
All right, sir.
Okay, well, then we'll admit that with those considerations as 133, and then we'll enter a late file exhibit as 134 with Mr. Rooks' explanations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No further questions. Thank you.
Okay, further cross.
Mr. Chairman, I had a few. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Joe Reed on behalf of Dominion Energy. Good morning, Mr. Rooks. I had just a few questions for you, if I may. As the rates guys, we've called you. First of all, I'll put up Mr. Elliott's Exhibit 133, and I know that there will be a late filed exhibit addressing or responding to some of the questions and answers that were just given. But I just want to make sure I'm clear. On this sixth column here, which reflects the Act 258 H4375 rate of 125.34. Do you see that, sir?
I do.
What Mr. Elliott attempted to do was to say, well, if the commission just approved the temporary rate and added in the effect of tax reform, then the bill would go to 118.38. Was that your understanding of where he was headed on this?
That's my understanding of his math.
And just so we're clear, you think that's just not right. That's dead wrong, actually, because you would instead of just recovering the financing costs on the NND, after this case, presumably, if the commission allows it, the company will be recovering the capital, the amortization of the NND rate base. Is that fair?
That's fair, and that's
would you
the deficiency in his analysis.
Would you explain that for the commissioners?
Well, under all of the plans that you see up there, obviously with the exclusion of the first column, which is where rates are today, there is a return of and a return on capital. So return on is what we've had in revised rates thus far, carrying costs on construction that has been approved to this point. So you have that return on, which is the financing cost, and then now, as this commission has before it, to determine what the appropriate level of abandoned costs are and the recovery of those costs over time through an amortization component, if you will. And so if you look at all of those plans, they include an element of financing cost and return of capital on the approved level of abandoned costs, depending on which plan you're looking at. And so they all include that with the exception of the H4375 rates, which is essentially just used the reduction that's been mandated by Act 258 to reduce the financing costs. So that's really all that's shown there in that particular column.
And so, assuming that this commission were to approve the recovery of a rate base of $2.772 billion for the N&D costs, which ORS has not challenged, I think it was your testimony that that rate would actually go up, even if you include the impact of tax reform. Is that correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
And that's what you'll depict in the exhibit that will be late filed, and that sort of undoes Mr. Elliott's math, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Now, just one other line of questioning, Mr. Rooks. In your role as the rates guy for SC&G, are you responsible for evaluating how SC&G's retail electric utility rates compare to the rates of other utilities?
I am.
And do you evaluate from time to time how those rates compare to certain industry averages?
I do.
And have you done an evaluation of how SC&G's rates would compare to those industry averages if the Commission were to adopt one of the merger benefits plans proposed by the joint applicants, Plan A or Plan B?
Yes, I have.
And let's talk about Plan B for the moment, because that's the one that, to your understanding, reduces the permanent rate the most. Is that fair?
That's correct.
So if this Commission were to adopt the joint applicants' merger Plan B, where would SC&G's rates fall compared to pertinent industry averages?
Well, compared to the South Atlantic average for EEI investor-owned utilities, it would be within 3%, about 3% higher than the South Atlantic average, and 9% below the national average.
All right, sir. And how does that compare to where SC&G's rates were before the implementation of H 4375, which, looking on Exhibit 133 here, that'd be the 147.53 in the left column. Where were the rates prior to the implementation of the temporary rate compared to the industry averages?
They were about 20% above the South Atlantic average and about 5.86% above the national average.
All right, sir. So a very significant reduction, which would bring those rates competitive to other South Atlantic peers?
Most definitely.
Right, that's leading. I mean,
This is cross-examination, Mr. Gile. Leading questions are permitted.
friendly witness, I mean, he really shouldn't be able to lead. They're joint applicants. They are not adversaries. A representative of the joint applicant should not be able to pretend to be asking non-friendly questions of an SCE&G witness. My gosh, they're going to buy these guys. They're a joint applicant. Mr. Reed is not cross-examining. He's offering friendly, direct, and it should not be a leading question, which it was. He's asking to agree or disagree with a formulation by his friendly counsel.
Mr. Gile, I think he certainly can ask leading questions, but I do think that there needs to be a limitation on friendly cross. If you could just kind of limit your questions to cross-examination questions and not get into the friendly cross quite as much, it would be better.
Absolutely. Although I think if we had eliminated friendly cross from this proceeding, we would have been done about a week and a half ago. Let me rephrase it, Mr. Butler, and I only have a couple more questions. How would you characterize the amount of the reduction in SC&G's rates that would result if this commission were to adopt Merger Plan B?
If they were to adopt Merger Plan B, again, compared to the South Atlantic average, that's about a 23%, or I'm sorry, that's about a 17% reduction. So it would go from about 20% above to about 3% above. And if you were looking at it on the national average, it would go from about 6% above to about 9% below the national average. And that's for Plan B in comparison to May 2017 rates.
Thank you, Mr. Rooks. Last question. Did you have an opportunity to sort of parse out where the rates would be by customer class? In other words, do you know where, for example, the industrial class rates would be if Merger Plan B were adopted compared to the industry averages?
Sure. If Plan B were adopted, the industrial rates would actually be about 23% below the national average, and about 9, again, we said this earlier, about 9% below on the national average and about 6% below the national average on commercial rates. So very, very attractive for customers.
How about compared to the South Atlantic average? Do you have those figures?
Yes. To the South Atlantic average, it would be about 3% above on residential again, and about 3 to 6% above the South Atlantic average on the commercial side, and about 14% below the national or below the South Atlantic average for industrial.
I just want to make sure I got that right. So if this commission were to adopt Merger Plan B as its result in this case, the rates for Mr. Elliott's industrial user clients would be 14% below the South Atlantic average.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Rooks. That's all the questions I have.
Other cross.
Mr. Chairman, I have a brief question or two for Mr. Rooks based on that last line of new questioning.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think Mr. Guile indicated he had no questions on Friday, so I'm not sure the nature of this particular line of questioning. I think it's time to move on to Commissioner's question.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, that was a new line of questioning. I did have, I'm exercising some restraint, Mr. Chairman. I hope you appreciate that. But that was a completely new line of questioning, not contained in the pre-filed directed. I'd just like to clarify a moment or two, a question or two, if I may.
And to the extent Mr. Guile had any interest in these issues on Friday, he could have asked it, but he indicated he had no questions.
No, that's not true. The last line of friendly cross-examination raised a new matter that was not included in pre-filed direct or other testimony, and I'd like to clarify because I believe the witness and counsel have misstated the record.
Okay, we're going to overrule. We're going to let him ask a couple of questions.
Mr. Rooks, Bob Guile, Friends of the Earth and Sierra Club. Just a question, too, for clarification. The last line of questioning from Mr. Reed, he used the term average rates, and you responded in light of that term, average rates, when you were comparing the Plan B to various other measures of rate impact, of rates prevailing in the region and the country, correct?
Yeah, these are typical bills billed out January 1st of 2018.
Well, that's the point. They weren't typical bills. They were average bills. That was the question. I listened carefully. Mr. Reed's question was average, and he used the term average, did he not?
Average here would be, you would get the same percentage results if you're looking at the average.
Well, that may be, but average and typical are not the same thing when one makes rate comparisons, are they?
Mr. Chairman, I object. First, it's argumentative. Second, he's misstating Mr. Rooks' testimony.
I heard the question clearly. Average was the term counsel used in the questions.
Overrule. We're going to let him ask that.
Now, a typical the typical value that you've used for residential rates is 1,000 kilowatt hours on rate 8 for a residential customer of SCE&G. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
All right. But that 1,000 kilowatt hours typical rate does not reflect average consumption or average bills for that same residential customer, does it, in the SCE&G system?
When you say an average rate, if you take the bill, $147.53, and divide it by 1,000, that would be 14 cents.
But that's not the average. The average represents not average consumption under rate 8 for a South Carolina residential customer, reflects heating and cooling impacts, and drives the average above 1,000, doesn't it? Isn't the average monthly consumption higher than 1,000 kilowatt hours a month for a rate 8 residential customer in South Carolina?
Probably a little higher, not materially.
And you're the rates guy, so what is it? If it's not 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, what is the average residential, or so we say, the average residential bill under rate 8 in the SCE&G system?
The average bill would probably, the usage would probably be closer to, I think, 1,100 or so.
All right.
Probably, if we're looking at the last 12 months, it's about 10% more, I guess, than the 1,000 that we've been using.
All right. And if one were to apply that, not just the typical bill, the 1,000, the numbers that you compared would be different, wouldn't they? And for South Carolina, they would be higher because the bills are actually higher based on that 1,100 or approximate 1,100 kilowatt hours a month and not 1,000.
The bills would certainly be higher if you had higher usage, correct.
All right, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Other cross. Commissioners. Commissioner Elam.
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Rooks, on what you just left off on, comparing these rates that were in the exhibit to EEI figures, I believe you said?
Correct.
And from January of 18?
These were rates that were billed January 1 of 2018, which is equivalent to our May of 17 rates. So we were all on the same basis there.
Okay. Did those rates include any Tax Cut Jobs Act cuts? In EEI's rates, the other states?
My understanding is no. They probably would not.
Okay. Mr. Richards, looking at pages 12 through 17 of your pre-filed direct testimony, in those pages you separately discussed 14 upgrade projects that were built as a result of the new nuclear development project, correct?
Yes.
Had any of the lines that you discussed experienced overloading conditions in the past?
Have any of these lines experienced overloading in the past?
Right.
You're talking about these new lines that we just built?
I'm talking about the existing lines before you built them.
Oh, in this corridor?
Correct.
I couldn't say.
Maybe, but it wasn't a persistent problem?
I'm trying to frame it right. Just let me think for just a moment, if you don't mind. If you had to, I couldn't speak for for the entire time that we've had these lines, that we had the existing the lines that were built or rebuilt. I couldn't speak for whether they had overloads or not. But I'll tell you, typically we don't allow overloads on our system. What we'll do is we have a RTCA tool, that real-time contingency analyzer, that runs every 15 minutes at most, and that tool looks at the next outage throughout our entire system. So it's constantly looking at the next thing that could be outaged. And we are always avoiding an overload based on that, the next thing that could be outaged. Now, you could have something catastrophic that comes through, like a hurricane, and knocks out more than one thing, and then you could have an overload. But I couldn't say whether or not those things, I just don't know.
Okay. For that corridor that you're talking about, did it experience... how well did it fare in catastrophic conditions before?
Again, I'd have to be kind of general and say that corridor was made up of wooden H-frame structures mainly. And so those are not going to fare as well as what we've built now, the steel reinforced, standalone structures without guy wires and things of that nature. And so they're not going to fare as well as what we have now. That's the only perspective I could give, but they fared as well as anything else that's wooden on our system.
Could any of the upgrades been delayed if units 2 and 3 were not being constructed?
I don't know that either, and I'm not trying to dodge it. I'm just it's very difficult to say, what if you do this? What if you do that? What if you do this? Because that leads you to nearly infinite results, right? And nearly infinite things you need to study. What if this gets delayed? What if that gets delayed? What if that doesn't happen? It's very difficult. You have to just kind of pick a plan and go with it. And now that we've gotten to our situation, if you look at Exhibit 3, that's what we'd be. That's the situation we'd be in now. If you revert those things, that these 14 upgrades, if you take those away and go back to what you had before, you will have problems on our system. I can't say what it would have been years ago.
Well, could you have said what it would have been if you had never made the upgrades?
I couldn't go back to that old. We don't even have we don't go back that far as the systems the models that we keep, and so I couldn't even go back. And then you have different standards from that time frame. I applied today's standards and tried to go back to what if we had the old H-frame stuff back in place to our current system? That's the only thing I could study with any kind of confidence.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Howard.
Mr. Richards, I'd start with you. What percentage or number of wooden structures are still on your system?
I don't know that. I'm sure we could provide that, but I don't know.
A guess would be fine.
I wouldn't even say I wouldn't even have a guess, sir. I mean, it's we certainly have a fair amount of wood still, but I couldn't even have a guess. I'm sorry, I just don't know.
You say over 50%?
I wouldn't even. I don't have a ballpark.
I don't think I'm getting anywhere with that question. So
yeah, I'm sorry. I just don't, because I'm a planner and I do take those things into account. But I'm more. I look at. I don't have to, for my standards, I don't look at probability of loss. I look at, is it going to be lost?
That's fine.
So I don't look at what structure may be lost over another structure or anything like that. As far
I'll Google it.
Yeah, you can Google it. You can figure it out. Yes, sir. Well, we can provide that, I'm sure.
If you would, I'd appreciate it. Just
all right.
So we know where we are.
Okay, do you want a late file
let's
exhibit
do a
on
late
that?
file on it.
Okay, we'll make that exhibit 135.
Talking about grid modernization, the new transmission lines you just put in, does it meet most of the criteria of a modern grid?
This new
Yeah.
stuff? Yes. We go with the National Electric Safety Code, make sure that we are satisfying that for ground clearance and swing out, and those types of things. And I'm not a transmission engineer. I'm a transmission planning engineer, so I don't do construction, but that's what I understand. They withstand the ice loading requirements and the hurricane force winds requirements of the National Electric Safety Code.
What about technology? Bidirectional flow, say, for example, or allowing distributed generation onto the system? Are they a better position to do that than the older transmission lines?
Well, anytime you have more capacity, you're going to allow for more things such as more distributed energy. You're going to allow for more things when you have more capacity. Absolutely. Bidirectional flow that can happen on anything that's networked. So
Okay.
there's the comparison's the same for that.
Mr. Rook,
Sir.
compare SC&G's rate design with that of Dominion. Do you know any difference in the rate design between the two companies?
I can't speak very well to Virginia Electric and Power. I believe that's their electric subsidiary, but I can't speak to their rate designs. I'm very familiar with ours, but not necessarily theirs. So
You don't know if they use trackers, or you don't know if they use future test years or things like that?
I believe they use. I've heard that they use riders, but I'm just not familiar with all the details behind their rate design and kind of how they do things in Virginia.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Commissioner Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's talk again a little bit about the new transmission line, if we could. I'd like to compliment you on your enthusiastic presentation explaining the new transmission line to us.
Thank you.
Right.
I'm young and eager.
Well, I think you are, and I want to congratulate you on that, and I hope
you.
you grow a long time with this wisdom. I enjoyed the cross with you and Miss Edwards and the examples that you used, and it brings us back that we still don't know a lot about where we are today and where you'll go when this new line goes into transportation. The questions have been that the line that's there now is working, and undoubtedly it could work on. You've talked about metaphors and other things, and after our Thanksgiving service Sunday, I think about the visualization of figuring out where we are today, and the decision this commission's got to make is we got to decide between you having the greatest and one of the top transmission lines in the country that is going to be probably a savings. I'm sure it'll be use and useful. This commission has got to decide whether it's use and useful today. And we got to balance that against the widow lady that has 3 bills to pay: utility, grocery, and drug, and which ones you can pay. So we've got a task. Is there any other information you could give us that might be a benefit to this commission on the use and usefulness of your transmission line today?
The one thing I'll have that I can offer up that might help, I hope, is I try to think, the analogy is great between transmission lines and roads. It just is. If you think about, I have to go through Malfunction Junction every day, and it's a pain. And when they take that thing out to replace it, when they take those lines, those roads out, and they have to start fixing it, widening it, that's going to be a pain. I'm also from Camden, South Carolina, and I had to drive through that I-20 situation when they were widening that around Clemson Road. And so I know what's coming. It's going to be even worse. And same thing goes with transmission lines. If you wait until you have a problem, you're in the curve. Then you're already oh no, you're going to spin out now. You're already in the problem. You can't wait. You got to get ahead of it. You got to stay ahead of the curve. And not many years ago, we started construction on these corridors. We finished the first one in I believe it was 2013, beginning of 2013. That was BCS 2. That's really not that long ago. 5 years ago, we completed that. And now, taking those things out of the picture and inserting the old corridor stuff, the old stuff into our current system, and that may not be satisfying as far as a study, but it's the best I could do. It really was. Inserting that in, you got immediate problems. You're already in the curve. You're already spinning out. So 5 years is not that long to all of a sudden have all these things start popping up. So I feel like we've gotten ahead of it. I feel like these things benefit our system. These lines and this construction benefits our system to satisfy our customers, to make sure that they're going to get the power they need. And also, one more thing I'll add to it. Where these lines, the power flows both ways. It flows north to south. It flows south to north. And what do we have at the hub, the VCS2 station? Right next door is VCS1. We got 3 tie lines. We call them bus ties over to VCS1 from VCS2. Direct ties. And what do you got there is a nuclear plant. And let's say you have a catastrophic problem on the as far the worst we've ever seen. If we had a blackout, I know that to get power back up to that nuclear station, those are great places. Those are great lines that you could use, and you're more than likely still going to have them because the wooden's probably going to be broken. It's probably going to be on the ground. I'm not going to say it will be. I'm just saying there's more likelihood of that wooden being on the ground. And these steel structures are going to still be standing, and you're going to get that power back to that nuclear station in a timely fashion so they don't have any more catastrophic problems, so they can cool that thing the way they need to not have any more problems. So all those things are adding up for a pro for these lines and these new upgrades.
Thank you very much. I hope your enthusiasm can spread through the room. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Good to have both of you with us today.
Morning.
Mr. Richards, wanted to follow up with you just a little bit about transmission lines. I think you had a little bit of an exchange with Commissioner Elam about the before you built the lines, before you put these lines in service, if you had any overloading or not. And seems like I remember maybe prior to him coming on the commission, maybe before you were in your current role, there was some, for lack of a better word, congestion here in northern Richland County with some of the substations. And I think you all may have done an allowable ex parte, or it might have been during one of the transmission proceedings itself on one of the 230 kV lines. But once that 230 kV line Killia, Northeast Columbia, that served the load out there was in service, used and useful.
The Pontiac 230 kV substation, is that
correct?
Possibly.
But there were some other minor upgrades I think you did or had to do temporarily to alleviate. Seemed like there was a smaller transmission project right here in northern Richland County, but weren't there some issues there prior to these lines being approved and coming in service that you recall? And I'm really speaking about northern Richland County, not quite as familiar with the St. George line going down to the Low Country You recall anything like that?
That's probably going back a little bit before I came on board, I think. If that's before 2008, then I probably wouldn't.
No, it had been since probably 2008.
Okay.
But not much. Like maybe 2009, 2010, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Anyway, you don't know of any issues that you can point to directly that it alleviated where the question Commissioner Elam was asking, because it seems like there were some issues you were having specifically in northern Richland County.
I know that what we've built since 2008, now that 230 kV line I'm speaking of, Pontiac, that feeds Pontiac, I think that's been there since before 2008. But we did rebuild a 115 kV line, but I don't know that we would have even, it's a 115 kV line.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember a 230 other than that one in that area right off the top of my head. But we you know, when we have problems arise in the coming years, we typically bring it to you. If it's going to be 230 kV, well, we have to. We're going to bring it to you and hopefully fix it in the best way. We either fix the thing that's going to be outaged or the thing that is going to overload. Either way fixes your problem.
Well, I just remember, I guess, a live diagram they put on the board one time, and it showed the current flows. But nonetheless, the transmission lines, as you said, as you had an exchange with Commissioner Hamilton, are used and useful and will withstand significant disasters and natural and other. And nonetheless, they're in service. So I think there was, with the exception of some questions Ms. Edwards had for you about other items that might have been in that siting. Now, there was a step-up transformer out at the site. That's, of course, not in these rates that we're referring to. Is that correct?
You're talking about at VCS2?
Yes.
Yeah, what I understand is and I don't do much with the finances, but I do understand there's about $85 million worth of equipment at VCS2, I think including VCS2, that's going to be written off as part, if we do with the Dominion merger. So I think
and that would probably include the step-up transformer and some of the switch yard that Ms. Edwards was questioning you about. Is that right?
I think the VCS2 switch yard is about $30 million, and that gets included in that $85 million write-off if the Dominion merger goes through. Now, I don't want to speak out of turn. You might want to ask somebody like Mr. Cocombs, but that's what I understand.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Rooks, kind of quickly, there's been a lot of back and forth about the rates, and I realize there are going to be some late-filed exhibits. We'll clarify some of this, but in your pre-file testimony, you had a number of tariff sheets attached. And just real quickly, if I could, and I've kind of made some notes here of numbers, and let's see if mine match what you have. Some numbers there that customers would pay that would be corresponding to your tariff sheets that were attached. I'm going to quickly go through these and see if this matches your numbers. Customer benefits plan to be $135.64. Is that correct? I'll give you a minute to get there. And again,
that's correct.
And I'm going to use 1,000 kilowatts. I'm not going to get into whether it's typical or average with you, but we'll just go with 1,000 for right now. $135.64 customer benefits plan. The no merger plan is $136.07.
Correct.
Reading that right?
Yes.
The base plan is $140.40.
Correct.
And then it's come out since you filed your testimony. You'd already filed your direct, but the alternative plan would be $126.96.
That's correct.
Okay. Last question. I think Mr. Elliott was asking, or maybe Mr. Challey was asking you the rate, let me get it right, whether it's the ORS plan or the 4375, the House Bill 4375 plan. I think there was some debate over whether the Tax Jobs and Tax Act had been filtered through that. Could you compare that along with this alternative plan rate we just?
Well, the effects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act are included in the joint applicant's alternative plan, but there are no tax impacts that are included in that H-43.
In the 4375, right.
And I think where Mr. Elliott was going, and I can't speak for him, but was to say that should be reduced further by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And what I was explaining is, as this commission makes its decision on what's the proper amount of abandoned costs to include, there will need to be some amounts for amortization annually that need to go into rates. That's not reflected here either. So if we want to just simply add tax reform to that, then we're not accounting for the amortization that will need to flow in as well. And that may be higher than the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in an impact. So the only point I'm making is to say that we should just simply add the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act onto those rates would not be, I don't think that's a fair comparison, because all of these other plans allow for the financing costs as well as those amortized, some level of amortized abandoned costs. So that was the point that I was making. We can't just take the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act amount singularly and make that impact without also taking into account the amortization level that would be needed under a plan.
Okay. So it's your testimony that the H-4375 rates, obviously, as you're saying, while they don't include the tax cuts, they also do not include anything for amortization over any period, 20-year, anything.
Yeah, correct.
And that being said, if that number, when you flush all that out, what's, in your opinion, what are we, about $1? What is it, $1.62 difference between that and the alternative plan? Is that, I don't even have the number right in front of me.
Well, certainly they're very close here, yeah, and I think you had the math right, about $1.62. But I would hate to say without, those are some pretty complicated questions, and I'd like to have our team take a look and get you the right number on a late filed exhibit before I would want to speculate.
And I will stop right there, because I do know that you've got a request for a late filed exhibit, and Commission will certainly take notice of that. And thank you, thanks to both of you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Okay, any redirect?
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Gentlemen, appreciate you being here and appreciate your testimony, and you are excused.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move to next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We call to the stand Dr. Glenn Hubbard. Have you been sworn, Dr. Hubbard?
Yes, sir, I have.
Please state your full name for the record.
Sure, it's Robert Glenn Hubbard.
And, Mr. Chairman, for the record, my name is Mitchell Willoughby on behalf of SCE&G, and I will be presenting Dr. Hubbard here today. By whom are you employed, Dr. Hubbard, and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Columbia University in New York, where I'm a professor of economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. I'm dean of Columbia Business School, where I'm also a professor of finance and economics.
Dr. Hubbard, I know that your CV is attached to one of your pieces of testimony, which we'll get to in just a moment. It's Exhibit 1 to your direct testimony in Docket 370. But would you provide the Commission with just a very brief summary of your education and professional background?
Sure. First, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the Commission for the accommodation and schedule. Because of teaching, this was a good day for me, so thank you very much. To Mr. Willoughby's question, I apologize, I'm not Glenn Hubbard, the baseball player. I'm an economist, and I've loved economics all my life. I got my undergraduate, master's, and PhDs in economics, undergrad at the University of Central Florida, and master's and PhD at Harvard University. I started my teaching career at Northwestern University in the Midwest, and then moved to Columbia Economics and Columbia Business School. My fields of interest range widely in economics, from macroeconomics and finance to energy economics and regulation. In my teaching, I've taught virtually every subfield of economics. I've written, I'm proud to say, the market-leading Principles of Economics textbook. In government, I ran the Office of Tax Analysis for President George H.W. Bush in the Treasury. And for George W. Bush, I was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House and the chairman of the OECD Economic Policy Committee. In business, I'm currently on the board of ADP, the payroll and human capital management company. I'm the lead director of MetLife, the insurance company, and I'm a board member of BlackRock Funds. I'm the co-chair of the National Commission on Capital Markets Regulation and a member of the National U.S.-China Commission.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hubbard. Dr. Hubbard, do you charge for your time in preparing pre-filed testimony and traveling here today to testify?
I do.
And how do you charge for that time?
I charge an hourly rate.
And what are your hourly rates currently, and how many hours have you devoted to getting here today?
My current hourly rate is $1,500 an hour. In time, I assume you mean by getting here today, the amount of time for this proceeding.
Correct.
I would estimate to about 60 hours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hubbard. Now, turning to your pre-filed testimony, in connection with this case, you filed 4 pieces of testimony, and I'm going to go through each one of those pieces, Dr. Hubbard. Initially, on August the 2nd, in docket number 2017-370, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed direct testimony consisting of 56 pages?
Yes, sir.
Are there any corrections or changes that you need to make to that testimony?
None that I'm aware of.
And Dr. Hubbard, if I asked you the questions that appear in that testimony, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Mr. Chairman, I would move the direct testimony of Dr. Hubbard in docket number 370 into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Dr. Hubbard's pre-filed direct testimony in docket 2017-370E will be moved into the record as if given orally from the stand, or entered into the record as given orally from the stands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Hubbard, did you have attached to that testimony 2 exhibits, one of which was your curriculum vitae, that we enter into the record as well?
Yes, sir, I did.
Are there any changes to those exhibits?
No, sir.
Mr. Chairman, we would move as the next hearing exhibit the 2 exhibits attached to Dr. Hubbard's direct testimony.
Dr. Hubbard's exhibits attached to his direct testimony will be entered as exhibit number 136.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hubbard, we're going to defer summaries until we get all of these pieces into the record. Next, I would direct your attention, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed? And docket numbers 2017-207E and 2017-305E on or about September the 24th, 2018 direct reply testimony consisting of 12 pages.
I did.
If I asked you, are there any corrections or changes to be made to that testimony, Dr. Hubbard?
None of which I'm aware.
If I asked you the questions that appear in that testimony, would your answers today be the same?
They would.
Mr. Chairman, I would move into the record, as if given orally from the stand, the direct reply testimony of Dr. Hubbard in connection with docket numbers 207 and 305.
Dr. Hubbard's responsive direct in dockets 207 and 305 will be entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And attached to your direct reply testimony, Dr. Hubbard, were 2 exhibits and also a copy, a complete copy, including your exhibits, of your testimony that was filed in a docket number, a direct testimony filed in docket number 370. Are there any corrections or changes to be made to your exhibits?
No, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I would move into the record as the next hearing exhibit the Appendix A, as well as Exhibits 1 and 2 of his direct reply testimony.
Okay, the Appendix A and Exhibits 1 and 2 will be entered as Exhibit number 137.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And next, Dr. Hubbard, in connection with docket number 2017-370E, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed a rebuttal testimony consisting of 58 pages?
Yes, sir.
Are there any corrections or changes to be made to that testimony?
None of which I'm aware, no.
If I asked you the questions that appear in that testimony, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Mr. Chairman, I would move into the record as if given orally from the stand, the rebuttal testimony of Dr. Hubbard, pre-filed in docket number 2017-370E.
Dr. Hubbard's pre-filed rebuttal testimony in docket 2017-370E will be entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Hubbard, in connection with the rebuttal testimony, did you have 8 exhibits attached to that testimony?
I did, yes.
Are there any corrections or changes to be made to the exhibits?
No, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I would move as the next hearing exhibit the 8 exhibits that were attached to Dr. Hubbard's pre-filed rebuttal testimony in docket number 370E.
The 8 exhibits attached to Dr. Hubbard's pre-filed rebuttal testimony will be entered as exhibit number 138.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And finally, Dr. Hubbard, did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed rebuttal testimony consisting of 12 pages and docket numbers 2017-207E and 2017-305E?
Yes, sir.
Are there any corrections or changes to be made to that pre-filed testimony?
None of which I'm aware.
If I asked you the questions that appear therein, would your answers today be the same?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I would move, as if given orally from the stand, the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Dr. Hubbard's in dockets 207 and 305.
Dr. Hubbard's pre-filed rebuttal testimony in dockets 207 and 305 will be entered into the record as though given orally from the stand.
And finally, Dr. Hubbard, there was 1 exhibit attached to your rebuttal testimony, and that exhibit included all of your rebuttal testimony and exhibits GH1 through GH8 that had been previously filed in docket 2017-370E. Are there any changes to be made to that exhibit?
No, sir.
I would move as the next hearing exhibit, Mr. Chairman, the Exhibit 1 attached to Dr. Hubbard's rebuttal testimony.
The Exhibit 1 attached to Dr. Hubbard's rebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as hearing exhibit number 139.
And Dr. Hubbard, have you prepared a summary of your 4 pieces of testimony?
Yes, sir, I have.
Mr. Chairman, let me pass that out, and then I will ask Dr. Hubbard to begin to summarize.
Thank you.
Dr. Hubbard, are you prepared to summarize your testimony?
Yes, sir.
Would you do so at this time?
Certainly. I'll start with the direct testimony. Good morning again, Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission. In the direct testimony, the first testimony Mr. Willoughby had referred to, I discussed the impact of the South Carolina Acts 258 and 271 on SCE&G customers and the general public interest as I saw it. I also addressed the potential impact on these stakeholders if the rate reduction imposed by the acts is made permanent by the Commission. And I do this as an economist to evaluate the process of utility rate making. Simply put, this is an exercise in balance. The goal of an effective rate regulation of a privately owned utility from an economist's perspective is to set rates in such a way that a proper balance is achieved between the interest of customers on the one hand and investors on the other. I note one of the Commissioner's questions earlier was exactly that. If the balance is tilted too much toward investors, then customers' rates are inefficiently high, and that causes negative economic effects, including overinvestment in utility assets and maybe underinvestment in something else. Conversely, if rates are set too low through an inappropriate disallowance or other regulatory action, investors will be unwilling to supply sufficient capital to the utility to enable it to provide the high-quality service people want at reasonable rates that they want. So in that scenario, customers would benefit directly in the short run through lower rates, but will experience either higher rates in the longer run due to a higher utility cost of capital, or either underinvestment or inefficient investment in utility infrastructure. So identifying and achieving the proper balance really depends, of course, up to you on the facts and circumstances of each rate case and requires difficult decisions. One of the primary economically relevant facts, though, in this case is the existence of the BLRA, which created, again, from an economist perspective, a very sensible framework for regulating the construction of a very large power project such as the new nuclear development project. Two major features of the BLRA were to provide a prudency review prior to permitting the project to be undertaken, and then once approved, to permit the utility to recover its financing costs during construction. The rules under which utility projects are initiated must be predictable and stable to be reasonable from an economic perspective, and importantly, to provide confidence to investors to risk their capital at reasonable rates. That proposition is well supported by a lot of economic research on the impact of political and regulatory systems on the economy and investment, both in the American utility industry as well as across many nations. Implementation of the acts will defeat this economically important predictability in the law by retroactively changing rules. Such an action can be characterized fairly from an economic perspective as what I called in my testimony a regulatory or political shock. That shock would cause SCE&G to suffer significant revenue loss and will increase regulatory and political uncertainty in the state of South Carolina. This increased uncertainty or risk will in turn lead to an increase in the company's cost of capital and other significant negative economic consequences for investors, customers, and the state of South Carolina. Clear evidence of the higher cost of capital due to an increase in investors' assessment of regulatory risk can be found in the published reports of debt analysts, including Fitch, Standard & Poor's, and Moody's. Higher levels of regulatory or political risk assigned by investors to the securities of a utility will also increase investors' required return on equity issued by that utility. Together with higher debt costs, the higher required return on equity will increase the utility's total cost of capital. This higher cost of capital would cause customer rates to be higher in the longer term to the extent that you allow that higher cost of capital to be passed along in rates, even though customers' rates might well be lower in the short run. In addition, SCE&G likely would have to reduce its capital investments or invest in less efficient infrastructure, leading to a reduced quality of service. Furthermore, there's evidence that regulatory opportunism can lead to spillover effects that cause a reduction in similar investments by other utilities in a state. If regulated utilities in South Carolina face increased risk of retroactive regulatory changes that prevent them from recovering previously approved capital expenditures, then financial constraints may force those utilities to eliminate or to defer necessary maintenance or improvements to the electric power system. All else equal, reduced investment in the state's electric system will result in lower service reliability and quality, including potentially slower recovery times following major hurricanes or other severe weather events, fewer jobs, and slower economic growth. The acts also are likely to reduce the confidence and willingness of utilities and possibly other businesses to invest. These harms could be long-lived and could have significant impact on SCE&G's ability to provide the quantity and quality of services that customers and you require. If the experimental rate becomes permanent, SCE&G would suffer hundreds of millions of dollars in additional lost revenue, which would have a larger negative impact on the company's financial condition, credit rating, and cost of capital. Furthermore, customers will ultimately bear the costs required to attract capital investments under the conditions imposed by the acts. If the Commission doesn't fully adjust rates to reflect a higher cost of capital, customers would then face indirect harm in the form of reduced or inefficient investment by the company and its investors, which may lead to electric service less reliable and robust, and all else equal, reducing employment and economic growth. The bottom line, again, is balance. That concludes my summary.
Thank you. That's the summary of your direct testimony. Now, Dr. Hubbard, if you would please summarize your direct reply testimony in dockets 207 and 305.
Certainly. In the direct testimony filed in dockets 2017-207E and 2017-305E, I discussed the financial consequences to SCE&G and its customers that may result if the Commission eliminates the revised rates revenues as requested by ORS and Friends of the Earth. I addressed this assignment by requesting that my August 2nd, 2018 direct testimony in docket 2017-370E be incorporated into the two dockets to which I referred earlier. My August 2nd direct testimony addresses the same topics I'm being asked to address here. Dr. Cooper's testimony contains at least three flaws from an economist's perspective. The first flaw is that he relies on hindsight bias in his assessment of purported flaws in SCE&G's economic analyses of the nuclear project at issue versus a natural gas combined cycle alternative. The large decline in natural gas prices we've observed in the past decade does not demonstrate that the original 2008 forecasts were flawed ex ante, as market participants generally didn't forecast a decline of this magnitude, largely due to new engineering technology. Second, Dr. Cooper appears to base his conclusion on the incorrect view that sunk costs of the NND project should count against the nuclear option, but not against the combined cycle alternative. For example, Dr. Cooper states that, and I quote, unjustifiable sunk costs were imposed on the alternatives, close quote. However, the appropriate approach in this case from an economic perspective is to compare the difference in cost between the two options at each decision point that you will make based on the going forward or projected future cost of each option, excluding sunk costs. That conclusion would hold whether the issue is analyzed from the perspective of an unregulated company or from the perspective of SCE&G and its customers under your jurisdiction. From the perspective of an unregulated firm, the concepts that sunk costs should be ignored is an accepted principle of financial decision-making. It's a core of Econ 101. In this case, which involves a regulated firm and its customers, sunk costs are also irrelevant because, as Dr. Cooper puts it, they're imposed on both the NND project and the combined cycle alternatives. To see this point, consider that under the BLRA, the sunk costs at any point in time would have been expected to have been prudently incurred and therefore would have been included as costs under both alternatives and included in rates regardless of which alternative is chosen. The net effect is really the same as the Econ 101 point, ignoring sunk costs, because when the two alternatives are compared, the sunk costs canceled, and all that's left is the remaining cost, quote, to go, Mr. Cooper's terms, or Dr. Cooper's terms, for each alternative. Third, Dr. Cooper ignores the likely increase in SC&G's cost of capital, as well as the other negative economic effects that would result from his proposal that all NND project costs be disallowed. Investors agreed to provide the capital needed to construct the nuclear plants with the understanding that the company would be able to recover all costs, including financing costs that were incurred and deemed prudent under the BLRA process. If investors' funds are then effectively expropriated by aggregating this agreement, and market participants come to believe that this expropriation is opportunistic, the cost of capital will increase for the company going forward, as well as reduce its incentive to invest, which likely will result in higher rates in the future and underinvestment or inefficient investment by SCE&G and perhaps other utilities in South Carolina. And that concludes the summary of the direct reply testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbard. And now would you turn to summarizing your rebuttal testimony in Docket 370?
Yes, certainly. In the rebuttal testimony, I address direct testimony of Mr. Scott Rubin and Mr. Lane Collin. With respect to Mr. Rubin's testimony, I find that an economic analysis of the facts and findings of the Duquesne opinion cited by Mr. Rubin is consistent with and supports the conclusions of the testimony that I offered. In fact, a contemporaneous economic study of that case warned of the potential significant negative economic consequences to investors and customers if regulatory rules of the game are changed after the fact in an opportunistic manner. That finding mirrors one of the key opinions I offered. In addition, and I would offer as important to you, there are at least two key differences from an economic perspective between Duquesne and this case, both of which support the opinions I gave you. First, the utility in Duquesne operated in a traditional rate-making framework based on an ex post prudence review. Here, the NND project was completed under the BLRA, which is an ex ante pure prudency paradigm. All else equal, this difference would lead to a greater economic impact from an opportunistic disallowance in this case, under the regime here, than under Duquesne. Second, this economic study I mentioned emphasizes that the court's decision in Duquesne was based in part on its finding that the effect of an opportunistic regulatory regime change on a utility, as measured by the size of the disallowance, must be slight, that's a quote, in order to be allowable. Here, the economic effect of the regime change, of course, can't be characterized as slight. Mr. Rubin and I both discuss economic characteristics of the regulatory process as they apply in this case, including with respect to the BLRA. From an economic perspective, the BLRA can be fairly characterized as an ex ante, before the fact, pure prudent investment regime, with provisions that allow the company to recover a return of and on the portion of its NND investment that is deemed to be prudent. This recovery is assured by the BLRA even if the plant is abandoned, assuming the decision to abandon is deemed to be prudent. In fact, I understand that all parties to this proceeding believe abandonment was prudent, but disagree as to the timing. Importantly, the ex-ante pure prudent investment nature of the BLRA encouraged investors to provide capital on more favorable terms for customers who would be the beneficiary of that than under a traditional rate-making framework. That reduced the financing costs borne by customers. Retroactively exposing those investors to risks they did not agree to assume would amount to changing the rules of the game after the game had started. And as I discussed in my prior testimony, would have negative economic consequences, including higher rates, all else equal, if viewed as opportunistic. Now, I agree with Mr. Rubin's conceptual point that the resolution of disputes involving investment costs incurred by utilities can result in losses for both customers and the utility. That's actually consistent with the balance that I mentioned from an economic perspective and the balancing principle in the famous Hope case. I note that the customer benefits plan in the proposed business combination with Dominion Energy does impose significant losses on SCE&G and its investors. And in fact, the company has already suffered significant losses as evidenced by the significant negative stock price reaction since the abandonment announcement. In fact, based on an event study, I estimate that SCE&G equity investors have lost $2.1 billion or more related to the abandonment and the related legislative retroactive change to the BLRA. And to be clear, event study simply means the stock price reaction filtering out market and industry effects. So this is the effect attributable to the regulatory change. With respect to Mr. Collins' testimony, I find from an economic perspective that it's incomplete and does contain some errors of analysis. First, Mr. Collins focuses solely on the relief provided to customers through lower rates obtained through NND project cost disallowances and rate reductions. While customers may well favor lower rates in a vacuum, a broader perspective is necessary to protect customer interests over the long run. To the extent that lower rates arise from a retroactive change to the law that's seen as opportunistic, investors should be expected to respond by increasing the cost of capital going forward. This higher cost of capital will in turn result in higher rates. Thus, in this case, the reduced rates Mr. Collins calculates are likely to be temporary in nature and perhaps offset by higher rates in the future. Further, Mr. Collins does not address the impact that these significant cuts would have on the financial integrity of SCE&G or its ability to provide electric service of acceptable quality to you and to customers. Along with these omissions, Mr. Collins' analysis contains some errors. First, by crediting customers with both the return on the Toshiba proceeds and a refund of revised rates, he's effectively double counted the benefits conferred to customers. Correcting this flaw by excluding the return on Toshiba proceeds from Mr. Collins' model would increase the present value of rates revenue in his model by about $83 million. Now, Mr. Collins appears to acknowledge this issue in his surrebuttal testimony by stating that the return on the Toshiba proceeds and refund of revised rates should be analyzed separately. This implies the two issues should not be included in the same rate-making calculation. Thus, there's really no basis to use SCE&G's allowed rate of return to calculate the return on the Toshiba proceeds. Alternatively, therefore, assuming that consumers are entitled to a return of the Toshiba proceeds, a return on the Toshiba proceeds, a lower rate of return is more economically appropriate. That's because it's certain. Use of an economically correct lower interest rate to calculate the return on the Toshiba proceeds leads to higher customer rates than those calculated by Mr. Collins. The calculation works out this way because the appropriate interest rate is lower than SCE&G's required rate of return. Correcting the calculations to include this lower, more economically sensible interest rate lowers the size of the return to which customers may be entitled, and therefore reduces the size of any potential regulatory liability associated with the return of the proceeds. Indeed, when I just used Mr. Collins' model, the increased present value of rates revenues would range from approximately $50 million to $72 million, depending on the type of interest rate used. Mr. Collin also incorrectly calculates a return on his refund of revised rates using, again, SCE&G's allowed rate of return. Indeed, this refund is certain. A lower rate is more economically appropriate. Adjusting his analysis to avoid this flaw increases the present value of rates revenue by $18 million to $26 million, depending on the approach used. Mr. Collins' analysis concluding that SCE&G would save about 33% of its administrative costs following the business combination, if you approve it, with Dominion, does not have a reliable basis. The estimate he offers you is based on a sample of only 2 prior acquisition targets, both of which were 18 years ago, and neither of which involved an electric utility. Finally, as noted, Mr. Collins' analysis focuses on reductions to SCE&G's approved recovery of NND project costs without recognizing or acknowledging the potentially higher rates and other economic costs that customers will incur in the future due to a higher cost of capital, as well as reduced or inefficient utility investment. In contrast, Mr. Rubin at least acknowledges that effective utility rate making involves the need to strike a balance between the interests of customers on the one hand and investors on the other. However, he greatly understates, from an economic perspective, the potential cost of increased regulatory risk. And so his recommendations I would view as not striking the appropriate balance. With a simple economic model, I demonstrate that the costs of increased perceived regulatory risk, my testimony, can be quite significant. Indeed, from an economic perspective, it is important in this case for the Commission to strike that balance between the cost to be borne by customers and the cost to be borne by the SCE&G investors. It's not for me to purport or attempt to advise you on how to do balance. That you will do. The proper balance depends on many factors you have heard and will hear, including the interpretation and administration of the BLRA, economic trade-offs between the short-term level of rates, short-term impact on the financial integrity of SCE&G, and the longer-term impacts on the cost of capital, and other factors such as certain benefits of the merger with Dominion and the testimony you've heard. If, again, the balance is tipped too far toward investors, customers will experience rates that are too high without an improvement in service. That's not good. Conversely, if balance is tipped too far toward the customers, given the circumstances, it will create additional costs in the future because market participants will see it as regulatory opportunism, and those costs can be significant. Toward the objective of balance, the balance in the interests of investors and customers that I discussed throughout these various pieces of testimony, I would note for you that the event study evidence that I presented, and again, this is the stock market reaction to unexpected events, filtering out what happened in the overall stock market or utilities generally. That evidence shows that SCE&G equity investors lost between $2.1 and $2.5 billion in value prior to the merger due to the regulatory and political challenges made to the BLRA. The total loss, that is not the unfiltered, but the total loss in market capitalization was over $3 billion. If the Commission were to ignore this burden that's already been borne by shareholders, it's already in the share price, it would risk, in my judgment, the negative economic consequences I addressed it in the testimony. And that concludes the summary of my rebuttal testimony.
Thank you, Dr. Hubbard. And if you would now summarize the rebuttal testimony in dockets 207 and 305.
Certainly. In the rebuttal testimony that I offered for the Commission, I responded to rebuttal testimony of Dr. Cooper. Dr. Cooper raises 4 issues where he disagrees with my direct testimony that was filed September 24th of this year. First, Dr. Cooper disputes my claim that his direct testimony relies on hindsight bias. However, to be clear, he compares a forecast made in 2008 to an actual outcome in 2018, uses actual cost overruns at the time of abandonment to evaluate a forecast from 2012, and relies on the fact that there was no acceleration in electric service demand after 2013 to criticize a 2013 evaluation of the cost of completing the nuclear project. Each of these comparisons is, by their very setup, hindsight. Second, Dr. Cooper suggests that he actually did consider sunk costs. However, it's not clear to me, for what it's worth, what this consideration means from an economic perspective. Specifically, in the testimony, I cited several examples from his testimony that demonstrate his incorrect treatment of sunk costs, including his suggestion that the sunk costs of the N&D project should be considered in a way that increases the cost of the nuclear option or decreases the cost of the combined cycle alternative. Third, and very importantly, Dr. Cooper seems to claim that a retroactive abrogation of the BLRA would be perceived as a one-shot, to use his words, problem that will pass with time, and therefore it either will not cause SCE&G's cost of capital to rise, or the other negative economic effects that I've identified, or that these negative economic effects will be attenuated. But he cites no evidence in support of that claim. It is true that the impact of a large disallowance may have a larger impact in the short term than the longer term, though through the negative effects that lower revenues will have on SCE&G's cost of capital. However, the negative economic effects that I described aren't due to the impact of a disallowance, but to a retroactive change to the rule of law, upon which investors had relied in committing their capital. Such a state action, if viewed by market participants as opportunistic, is an economically significant event that would increase investors' assessment of the risks of doing business with SCE&G and potentially other regulated entities in the state. This increased cost of capital and other economic harm under this scenario would apply to both the short term and the long term, and the existence of such harm is supported by economic theory and empirical evidence that I mentioned in my direct testimony. Fourth, Dr. Cooper claims that imposing NND project costs on customers may lead to a death spiral, his words, for SCE&G because it would cause an economically meaningful number of customers to choose to self-generate. He argues that avoiding such a death spiral by disallowing the NND costs may be better for SCE&G and its customers than the possibility of higher financing costs. However, he doesn't cite any evidence to suggest that alternative generation options such as solar would make more economic sense than staying with SCE&G for a sufficient number of customers with a sufficient number of load. As a result, at least from an economic perspective, I would assign little or no weight to that point. Finally, Dr. Cooper claims I failed to acknowledge the alleged withholding of information from the Commission. That's not an issue for me to judge. It's really for you to judge. But I do understand that a number of parties, including the ORS, have had the opportunity to scrutinize the project and its costs. And that concludes the summary of my rebuttal testimony.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hubbard. Mr. Chairman, Dr. Hubbard is available for cross-examination and questions from the Commission.
Okay, we'll go to cross-examination in about 10 minutes after we take a break.